Christmas Eve of all nights, Laura didn't even have a chance to mull it over before she swung the door wide, only to find a bunch of lawyers standing there, clutching a folder stamped with her name. Just an hour before, she dropped off some food and a couple of presents for an old man, lost in his grief, not expecting a single thing back for her trouble. Little did she know what came next was about to flip her whole world upside down. Snowflakes floated lazily down onto the hushed streets of Pine Hollow, blanketing rooftops and sidewalks in a soft, wintry hug. Inside the cozy, glowing homes, folks were huddled up for Christmas Eve, their laughter and cheerful tunes spilling out into the night. But there was one place that stayed shadowy and still, sticking out like a sore thumb. Laura Thompson tugged her coat a little snugger around her as she strolled by the grand old Victorian mansion down at the end of Birch Street. No festive wreath hung on the door, no sparkling lights blinked in the windows, just a big empty void. She eased her pace as she hit the front porch. There, an old guy was slumped in a rocking chair, gazing off into nothing, like the world had faded away for him. His silver hair was tidy, combed just so, and his coat was buttoned up tight, but his face carried this hollow, faraway look that tugged at her. She knew who he was. Mr. Edward Sullivan, once a big-shot business tycoon, the kind of guy who used to run this town's wealth with an iron grip. But after his wife and son passed, he'd shut himself off, disappearing from everyone and everything. And now, here he was, on Christmas Eve, all by his lonesome. Laura swallowed hard, a lump rising in her throat. She got it. She knew what it was like to wrestle with tough times. At 32, scraping by as a social worker, she'd crossed paths with way too many folks the world had left behind. Not tonight, though. She wasn't letting that happen. She spun on her heel and hightailed it to the little diner just down the road. 10 minutes later, she was back, arms loaded with a steaming meal, a mug of hot cocoa, and a small gift wrapped up nice and neat. She trudged up the porch steps and gave the door a gentle rap. Nothing at first, just quiet. Then the sound of slow shuffling steps. The door groaned as it opened, and there stood Edward, his eyes keen but worn out, like he'd seen too much. His tone came out flat, almost bored. "Look, I'm not buying whatever you're peddling." Laura flashed a warm grin, holding up the bag like a peace offering. "No sales pitch here, Mr. Sullivan. I just figured." She paused, picking her words, nobody ought to be by themselves on Christmas. His eyes darted from her face to the food, his fingers tightening on the edge of the doorframe like he wasn't sure what to make of her. "Yeah, and what's in it for you?" "Not a darn thing," she replied, her voice soft but steady. A beat passed long and heavy. Then, with a quiet huff, he shuffled to the side. "Get in here before you turn into an icicle." Laura trailed after him into the house. The massive hallway loomed ahead, all fancy and polished but cold as a tomb, like some forgotten exhibit stuck in the past. No holiday cheer, no life. They stepped into the sitting room, where a fire popped and snapped in the hearth, throwing off a faint glow. Edward sank into an armchair, looking like he carried the weight of years. Laura plopped the meal down in front of him. "It's nothing fancy, but it's..." Edward gave her a long sizing-up look before reaching for the cocoa. "Been years since anybody bothered bringing me a Christmas supper." Laura's smile widened a touch. "Well, then it's about time someone did." For the first time in ages, Edward Sullivan sat down to a Christmas Eve dinner with another soul at his table. He didn't say much at the start, keeping his words sparse. But as the room grew cozier, a sense of ease crept in alongside the warmth. He opened up about his wife and son, sharing pieces of the family he'd lost to time and tragedy. Laura didn't just hear him out with some sad, pitying look. She got it. Really got it, with a quiet kind of empathy. Once they polished off the meal, she slid a little wrapped box his way. Edward's brow creased as he stared at it. "What's this supposed to be?" Laura gave a small shrug. "Oh, just a tiny something I thought you might like." He paused, unsure, then set it off to the side on the table. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Laura pushed herself up from her seat. "I really appreciate you letting me hang out here," she said warmly. "I'm guessing this wasn't how you pictured your night going." Edward let out a slow breath. Christmas wasn't either, to be honest. Her chest tightened with a pang for him. At least tonight, he hadn't faced it solo. He glanced her way, and she caught a spark in his eyes, maybe gratitude or even a whisper of hope breaking through. Laura dipped her head in a quiet nod and started for the door. "Miss Thompson," he called out, his voice softer than before. She stopped in her tracks. "Thanks," he murmured. A smile tugged at her lips. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Sullivan." With that, she stepped out into the biting night air, totally unaware that her life was on the verge of a massive shakeup. Barely an hour later, a knock on her door would turn everything she knew upside down. Laura wandered home through the stillness of the streets, the chilly night nipping at her cheeks. A gentle snow had picked up again, draping Pine Hollow in a shimmering fresh coat of white. Even with the cold seeping in, she felt a glow inside, something deeper and toastier than she'd felt in forever. She hadn't set out expecting much from this evening. Stopping by Edward Sullivan's place wasn't even on her radar until some tug in her gut told her to go for it. And tonight, after years of gloom, she'd spotted a shift in his gaze, a faint glimmer cutting through the shadows he'd been stuck in. She grinned to herself as she got to her little apartment, brushing the snow off her coat with a quick shake. Maybe it didn't mean much in the grand scheme. Maybe come morning, Edward would slip right back into his lonely routine, acting like tonight was just a blip. Still, for a few hours, he hadn't been on his own. She dropped her purse on the counter, kicked her boots off by the door, and was about to brew a steaming cup of tea when a loud rap jolted through the quiet. Laura's brow furrowed. It was well past midnight. Who'd be banging on her door now? She hesitated, then patted over to check it out, peering through the peephole. Her stomach did a flip. Two guys in slick dark suits stood there, looking like lawyers straight out of a movie. She cracked the door open, cautious as could be. The older one, decked out in a crisp navy coat, gave her a polite smile. In his hand was a hefty envelope that screamed official business. "Miss Thompson?" Her heart did a little stutter. "Yeah, that's me. I'm David Lawson, Mr. Edward Sullivan's lawyer. He'd like you to come see him right away." Laura blinked, thrown off. "Edward?" David gave a quick nod. "Yep." He said, "It's pressing." Her pulse kicked up a notch. "Is he okay?" "He's doing fine," David reassured her, calm as anything. "But he was adamant we track you down tonight." Laura's eyes darted between the two men, her thoughts spinning like a top. Edward had hardly let her cross his threshold earlier that night, so why was he dragging her back in the dead of night? She wavered for a second, but there was something in David's voice, a quiet urgency that told her this wasn't something she could just brush off. "Hang on, let me snag my coat," she said, already turning toward the hook by the door. A handful of minutes later, she was tucked into the plush back seat of a sleek black sedan, staring out as the snow-dusted streets of Pine Hollow streaked by in a blur. The whole ride, her mind churned, trying to stitch together what in the world could be going on. When they rolled up to Edward's mansion, her hands felt like blocks of ice, even with the car's heater cranked up full blast. The place hadn't changed a bit since she'd left. Still dark, still silent, looming against the snowy night like some forgotten relic. David guided her up the front steps and gave the door a single sharp knock. Barely a beat later, the big wooden thing swung open. Edward stood there, sharper and more awake than he'd been earlier, his weary eyes latching onto Laura. He sized her up for a quiet moment before shifting to the side. "Step inside," he said, his tone steady. Laura shot a quick look at David, then crossed into the house, warmth washing over her like a wave. The sitting room looked almost identical to how she'd left it, except now the fireplace was blazing, throwing dancing shadows across the walls. Edward settled into his armchair with a slow creak and waved a hand for her to take the seat opposite him. She sank down, her pulse hammering in her chest. "Mr. Sullivan, what's all this about?" she asked, her voice tight. Edward let out a long breath, rubbing his palms together like he was warming them up. He seemed to wrestle with finding the right thing to say, and for a split second, she wondered if he'd back out of whatever he'd called her here for. Then he started talking. "It's been a long stretch since I've let myself trust anybody, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice dropping low and soft. "After I lost my wife and son, life taught me a brutal lesson. Folks will use you up if you let them. All those friends I thought I had vanished the second the dust settled, only ever chasing my cash. Laura gave a small nod, still clueless about where he was headed with this. He pressed on, his eyes locked on hers, unwavering. But you didn't show up tonight fishing for anything from me. You barely knew me, just some old guy's name and a lonely figure sitting by himself on Christmas Eve. You hauled in food and stuck around because it felt right to you, plain and simple. A knot tightened in Laura's chest. She started, but Edward raised a hand to cut her off. Hold on, I need you to hear me out. David stepped up then, sliding a fat envelope onto the table between them. Underscore 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 underscore. Laura swallowed hard, her throat dry. Edward drew in a deep breath, steadying himself. I'm running out of time, he said, blunt as a hammer. Her stomach plummeted. The doctors won't come right out and admit it, but I can feel it in my bones, he added matter-of-factly. I've been getting ready for the end for years now. Only thing I could never settle on was who'd get all this when I'm gone. Laura's breath whooshed out of her, leaving her dizzy. No family, no kids to pass it down to. My lawyers have been scribbling wills and tearing them up for ages, but I could never put my name to one, he nodded toward the envelope. That changed tonight. Laura shook her head, dazed. Wait, I don't get it. A faint smile tugged at Edward's lips. It's yours now. I'm handing it all over to you. The room went dead quiet. Laura's breath snagged in her throat. What? She barely managed to get the word out. You heard me right, he said, calm as ever. Her mind spun out of control. No way. This has to be some mix-up. I hardly even know you. Edward let out a dry chuckle. That's the point, isn't it? Out of every soul I've crossed paths with, you're the only one who showed up with nothing to gain and everything to give. Laura's thoughts whirled like a storm in her skull. This is nuts. I can't just take. David cut in with a polite cough. Miss Thompson, Mr. Sullivan's estate clocks in at more than $70 million. Her mouth turned to sandpaper, words drying up on her tongue. Edward shifted forward in his chair, his face gentling a bit. I'm not picturing you grabbing it all and jetting off to some lavish life, Laura. I've got you figured out. You're the type who gives, not takes. You'll put it to work for folks who need it, and that's the whole reason I picked you. Her hands shook like leaves in the wind. I don't even know how to respond, she stammered. Just tell me you'll mull it over, Edward replied, keeping it short and sweet. Laura let out a wobbly breath, her chest rattling with it. Her brain was yelling, no. Too wild. Too far-fetched. But way down deep, a quiet truth settled in. The second she'd rapped on Edward's door, her world had tilted on its axis, and there was no going back to how things were. She spent the next few days in a haze, her thoughts swirling like a whirlpool, unable to settle. She'd gone from being a social worker, just trying to get by, to being handed control of a vast fortune. The weight of the decision weighed on her, and every time she tried to talk it out with someone, the words didn't quite seem to make sense. Who would understand? How could they? Her friends and family were, of course, thrilled for her, but each conversation left her more confused. The idea of suddenly possessing so much wealth felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She wasn't a person of grand desires, and the thought of splashing out on expensive luxuries didn't sit well with her. But what about the people she could help? Could she use the money to make a difference in Pine Hollow? Could she turn the wealth into something bigger than just an inheritance? The more Laura thought about it, the more it became clear to her, she didn't want to simply hold on to the money for the sake of holding on to it. She had to put it to use. But how? Days turned into weeks, and life in Pine Hollow seemed to return to normal. Christmas had come and gone, and the town had settled back into its everyday rhythm. But for Laura, everything had changed. The mansion loomed at the end of Birch Street, silent and grand, like a castle from another era. She still saw Edward, though less frequently. His health was declining, and the sparkle of hope she'd glimpsed in his eyes had all but faded. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to be done. More to this whole situation than just her being in the right place at the right time. She had the power to help. The question was, what would she do with it? In the meantime, life in Pine Hollow pressed on. People still dropped by the local diner, still complained about the weather, still talked about the same things they always had. But now, whenever Laura walked through town, she felt a weight on her shoulders, the responsibility pressing her down like 1,000 pounds. She wasn't just a social worker anymore. She was someone who could change lives, for better or for worse. She could either let it all slip through her fingers or use it to create something worthwhile. One afternoon, after much contemplation, Laura decided to go back to the mansion. She had to see Edward again. Maybe he had more to say. Or maybe she just needed some closure. She made her way through the snowy streets, the chill biting at her cheeks. As she approached the house, she noticed that the shutters were closed. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. It seemed even emptier than before. She knocked on the door, unsure what to expect. A few moments passed before the door opened. Edward stood there, looking frail and worn. He was even more fragile now than she remembered, the years catching up with him in a way that had been impossible to ignore. But his eyes still held that spark of something that made her think he hadn't entirely given up yet. "Miss Thompson," he said softly, his voice raspy. "I didn't expect you. Can we talk?" Laura asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course," Edward replied, stepping aside to let her in. They sat down together in the same sitting room where they'd shared a meal months earlier. This time, however, the warmth of the fire couldn't chase away the chill in the air. The weight of the conversation seemed to hang over them both. "I've been thinking a lot," Laura began, her voice barely a whisper. "About the money. About everything you've left me." Edward nodded, his gaze steady. "I know this is a lot to ask, but I think you're the right person to carry it forward. You've already shown what kind of heart you have. It's not about the money. It's about what you can do with it." She thought for a long moment, trying to piece together the words. "I want to help. I want to make a difference. But I don't know how." Edward smiled faintly. "That's the first step, Miss Thompson. Wanting to make a difference. You'll figure the rest out. I have faith in you." And just like that, she knew. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the people who needed help, the people who needed someone to give them a chance. She walked out of the mansion that day with a new sense of purpose. There would be no turning back. She would take Edward's legacy and turn it into something real, something that mattered. Pine Hollow might be a small town, but its people mattered. And so did she. Underscore 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 underscore. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and frantic planning. Laura poured herself into organizing how she could best use the money. Her first priority was always Pine Hollow, the people who had given so much to her over the years, and those who had quietly suffered behind closed doors. Her first step was to call a few local nonprofits. After all, they had the expertise and infrastructure to do good work in the community. But she found herself frustrated. The more she spoke with them, the more she realized that many of these organizations were bogged down by bureaucracy and inefficient management. The money would help, but it wasn't enough to make a long-lasting change. What Pine Hollow needed was something more sustainable. One evening, as she sat at her desk, sifting through paperwork, an idea began to form. She could create her own foundation, one that wasn't bogged down by red tape, one that could focus on the most pressing needs of the town, housing for the homeless, support for struggling families, after-school programs for kids, and job training for adults. She could make a real difference, not just by donating money but by creating a community of support that would last long after she was gone. It wasn't a decision she made lightly. Starting a foundation would take time, effort, and, most importantly, a lot of money. But she had the resources, and, more than anything, she had the drive. She knew she could pull it off. If she worked hard enough, this town would never be the same again. As she started planning, she turned to the people she trusted. She reached out to her colleagues in the social work field, asking for advice. She sought out experienced people who had run nonprofits, people who had the knowledge and skills to help her make the right choices. She knew this was a huge responsibility, and she needed all the help she could get. The foundation would be a long-term project, something that would require constant attention and growth. Laura knew she couldn't do it alone, but she also knew she had to be the driving force. She was the one who had to take that first step. And so, day by day, she made progress. She started laying the groundwork, building partnerships with local businesses, and gathering a team of dedicated volunteers. The news of the foundation spread quickly through Pine Hollow, and people began to rally behind her. The town's residents, many of whom had been skeptical or indifferent to Edward's wealth and his decision to leave it all to someone they didn't know, began to change their minds. Laura wasn't just giving them handouts. She was creating opportunities. She was showing them that they mattered. But not everyone in Pine Hollow was on board. Some of the wealthier residents were suspicious of her new venture, questioning her ability to manage such a large sum of money. They doubted her commitment, believing she would eventually abandon the project or that it would fall apart like so many other good intentions. The criticism stung, but Laura wasn't deterred. She had a vision, and she was determined to see it through. In the months that followed, the foundation took shape. Laura had assembled a team of passionate individuals who shared her commitment to making Pine Hollow a better place. They started small but gradually expanded their efforts. They created a shelter for the homeless, providing a safe space for those who had nowhere else to go. They opened a community center where kids could hang out after school and get help with their homework. And they launched a job training program that taught adults valuable skills, helping them find stable work. The foundation wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, delays, and moments when Laura wondered if she was in over her head. But every time she doubted herself, she remembered the reason she'd started this journey in the first place. She wasn't doing it for the money, or for the recognition. She was doing it for the people of Pine Hollow, and she would keep going as long as they needed her. Then, one afternoon, she received a call from Edward's lawyer, David Lawson. It had been months since she'd last seen him, and she wondered why he was calling her now. "Miss Thompson," David's voice crackled through the phone. "I need you to come to the mansion. There's something you need to see." Her heart skipped a beat. It had been a long time since she'd set foot in that grand, cold house. Something told her this call wasn't just about business. There was something else. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, before hanging up. As she drove through the snowy streets toward Edward's mansion, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to face something important. The mansion, still standing tall against the winter landscape, seemed different now. The air was thick with anticipation. David met her at the door. He was dressed in his usual suit, but his expression was more serious than she remembered. "Miss Thompson," he said, leading her inside. "You should sit down." Laura sat on the same armchair she had occupied months ago, when Edward had handed her the inheritance that had changed everything. She could still feel the weight of that moment in her bones. Edward was sitting in a chair by the fire, looking frail but alert. His health had continued to decline, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "Thank you for coming," Edward said, his voice quieter than usual. "Of course, Mr. Sullivan," Laura replied, her heart heavy with anticipation. Edward hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to let you know that I've made some changes to my will. After much thought, I've decided to leave everything I have to the foundation." Laura's mouth went dry. "What?" But the estate is yours." "I don't understand." Edward nodded, his eyes soft. I know you've been working hard to make Pine Hollow a better place. I want to make sure the foundation can continue its work long after I'm gone. I don't have much time left, Laura, and I want to make sure the town is taken care of. I want to leave a legacy, even if I'm not around to see it." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she absorbed his words. This was more than she could have ever hoped for. Edward wasn't just giving her money, he was giving her the responsibility to continue the work they had started together. "Thank you," Laura said, her voice trembling. "You don't know what this means." Edward gave a faint smile. "I trust you. You've already proven yourself. Just keep doing what you're doing." Over the next few weeks, Laura worked tirelessly to incorporate Edward's contributions into the foundation. The money he left behind was enough to ensure the future of the programs, the shelters, the job training, and the community center. Pine Hollow had been given a second chance, and it was Laura's job to make sure it thrived. As the foundation grew, so did Laura's reputation. She became a symbol of hope in the town, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were still people who cared. The residents of Pine Hollow, once skeptical, now rallied behind her with unwavering support. The town had found a new purpose, and it was all thanks to Laura's vision and Edward's trust. And yet, even as the foundation flourished, Laura couldn't forget the moment she had walked into Edward's mansion, the weight of the decision he had made pressing down on her. She had been given a rare gift, a chance to make a difference. And she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. But as the foundation expanded and Laura's influence grew, she couldn't help but wonder what else was in store for her. What would her future look like now that everything had changed? Pine Hollow was on the verge of something big, and so was she. Underscore 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 underscore. Days turned into weeks, and as Pine Hollow began to transform under the foundation's efforts, Laura found herself stepping into a new role, one that was both rewarding and overwhelming. She had always been a social worker, helping people one-on-one, but now she was overseeing a whole community initiative. Every decision she made felt heavy, as if the weight of the entire town's future rested on her shoulders. She spent countless hours in meetings with her team, refining the programs and ensuring they were reaching the people who needed them most. The shelter was always full, but they had also expanded to include a job training and placement program. They had partnered with local businesses to create internships and apprenticeships for people who had been out of work for far too long. It wasn't just about giving people handouts, it was about offering them the tools they needed to stand on their own 2 feet. The community center had become a hub for the kids in Pine Hollow. After-school programs flourished, providing a safe space for children to learn, play, and grow. The local schools had seen improvements in attendance and grades. Some of the children who had once struggled now found a sense of purpose and confidence. And, through it all, Laura found herself more determined than ever to ensure that this success didn't fade into the past. But the work was exhausting. And despite all the progress, there were still those who doubted Laura's ability to maintain it all. She had heard whispers about her behind closed doors. The wealth had changed her, they said. It was too much for one person to handle. The pressure weighed on her, and every so often, she would catch herself wondering if they were right. Could she really do this? Edward's health had continued to decline. He was frail, pale, and often in pain. Yet, whenever Laura visited him at the mansion, he always seemed to have a quiet smile on his face. He'd tell her stories of his wife and son, of the life he had built and lost. It was bittersweet, but Laura always found comfort in his presence. He wasn't just a benefactor to her, he had become a friend, someone whose wisdom she sought out whenever she needed guidance. On one of her visits to the mansion, she found Edward sitting in his chair, looking out the window at the snow-covered streets. His face was tired, but there was a spark of clarity in his eyes. "Laura," he began softly, "I want to tell you something. You've been doing wonderful work here, and I'm proud of you. But there's something you need to know about the money I left you." Laura frowned, sitting beside him. "What is it, Mr. Sullivan?" Edward paused, as if weighing his words carefully. The estate, it's more than just wealth. It's a legacy. And with it comes responsibility. You've been doing great so far, but you must remember why you're doing this. It's not about the money or recognition. It's about the people. Always the people. Laura's heart swelled with gratitude, but a deep sense of responsibility settled in her chest. He was right. The money didn't belong to her, it was a means to an end. The end was creating lasting change in Pine Hollow. As long as she kept that in mind, she would be able to navigate this challenge. Her next challenge came sooner than she expected. One chilly morning, she received an unexpected visitor at the office. It was an older woman, dressed in a thick wool coat, her face stern and full of worry. "Are you Laura Thompson?" the woman asked, her voice firm but quiet. "Yes, I am," Laura replied, rising from her desk. "How can I help you?" The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "My name is Margaret Davis. I represent some of the older residents here in Pine Hollow, those who don't have the resources to speak up. We've heard about the foundation, and frankly, we're concerned." Laura's brow furrowed in confusion. "Concerned? About what, exactly?" Margaret took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "There are those of us who feel that the foundation is not doing enough for the elderly. The programs you've set up are wonderful for young people and families, but what about us? What about the people who have spent their whole lives building this town and now find themselves alone, with no support?" Laura felt a pang in her chest. She had always been passionate about helping the vulnerable, but the elderly were a group she hadn't yet focused on. She knew that Pine Hollow had a large population of senior citizens, many of whom had lived there for decades, but she hadn't realized how deeply the lack of resources was affecting them. "I'm so sorry," Laura said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I never meant to overlook anyone. I've been so focused on the programs for the younger generations and families that I didn't realize we were neglecting the elderly. I can promise you that we'll do more to support them." Margaret nodded, but there was a look of doubt in her eyes. "I hope so, Miss Thompson. These people need help now, not later." Laura stood there, feeling a mixture of guilt and determination. She had made great strides, but there was still work to be done. She couldn't allow any group to be left behind, not when she had the means to make a difference. This was a wake-up call. She had to refocus, to find a way to balance the needs of all the residents in Pine Hollow. The next day, she began researching programs for the elderly, reaching out to experts in geriatric care and social services. She realized that there were gaps in the services available to seniors. Many were isolated, living in old houses without proper heating, or struggling with health issues that went untreated because they didn't have access to affordable healthcare. The foundation could do more to help them, and she was determined to make that happen. By the end of the month, she had launched a new initiative called Golden Years, designed specifically to address the needs of Pine Hollow's senior population. They established a senior community center where older residents could gather for social activities, and they launched a home assistance program that provided meals, housekeeping, and transportation for those who were unable to leave their homes. The response was overwhelming. Seniors who had once felt invisible in their own town now had a place where they could feel valued and cared for. Margaret Davis, who had initially been critical of Laura, became one of the foundation's most passionate advocates. The elderly of Pine Hollow finally felt seen. The success of Golden Years filled Laura with a sense of pride, but she couldn't afford to rest on her laurels. She still had so much to do. The homeless shelter needed expansion, and the job training program needed more resources to ensure that everyone who wanted to work had the skills to do so. The community center was thriving, but there was always room for improvement. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Laura found herself sitting on a bench in the park, looking out over the town. The streetlights flickered softly in the distance, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the nearby school. Pine Hollow was a different place now, but it was still home. She thought about Edward, about the legacy he had left her, and about the responsibility she had taken on. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And as long as she kept pushing forward, she knew she would keep changing lives. In the weeks that followed, the foundation continued to grow. They expanded their outreach to neighboring towns, helping families in need beyond Pine Hollow. They worked with state and national organizations to secure funding and resources to make the town's initiatives sustainable. The foundation was no longer just about one person's vision, it had become a collective effort, a community movement. Laura stood at the forefront of it all, but she knew she couldn't have done it alone. The people of Pine Hollow had rallied behind her, and together, they had created something remarkable. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the town and for Laura. And as the years passed, the town of Pine Hollow flourished. The foundation continued to provide support and opportunity to those who needed it most. Laura, now a well-respected leader in the community, looked back on everything she had accomplished with a sense of fulfillment. She had turned a simple act of kindness into a legacy that would last for generations. But it all started with one decision, one moment, when she decided that no one should be alone on Christmas Eve. That was the moment everything changed.